This is Rockhampton with Nyree Johnson, the show about the people who hold our region together, the volunteers, the founders, the quiet achievers behind our businesses, clubs, charities and not-for-profits. Real stories told plainly from people serving Central Queensland with heart. Here's Nyree.
All right. Today's guest is Andrea Friend. So, Andrea is a councillor with the Livingston Shire Council on the Capricorn Coast and someone whose approach to life and community advocacy and community service is something that I admire a lot about Andrea. And I am so excited to have her on the podcast today to share a little bit about her story and her work and her community. And before we really get stuck into it, I do just want to share a little disclaimer that we will be talking about infant death and adoption on the podcast today, in addition to Andrea's broader story. So please just be aware that that will come up. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Andrea. It's absolutely fantastic to have you here.
Nyree, I've also been excited all day about this, so thanks for having me.
You are very welcome. So before we really get stuck into it, I'm very curious to know if you could be an expert at anything at all in the world, what would it be and why?
Goodness. Well, if I could be an expert for anything in the world, would you believe it would be astrophysics? I mean, I love space
Hmm.
and it's always fascinated me. And currently I'm reading Dr. Matt's Guide to Life in Space, and he's an Australian astrophysicist and explains theories in an easy to understand type of language. And I've also read Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. You know, I look up at the night sky and I just marvel at the planets and the worlds beyond
Mm.
our reach. So it's just fascinating to me.
I love that. I'm sure you've already done this quite a few times, or maybe once or twice. But for a while there, the Capricorn Caves was having astronomy nights
They,
where
yeah,
yeah, they would bring people in and like experts, and I remember being impacted for weeks following one of those astronomy nights. Just my mind was blown with what was shared with me. And I'm thinking, wow, this big, giant, wide world universe, and we're just a little speck of time.
exactly right. And that's what it is. We have to really try to enjoy our lives as much as we can, because you're quite spot on. It is a speck in time, and
Mm.
so, yeah, my husband and I went down to Queenstown, up in Bob's Peak, and we had a night of astronomy where we just through the telescopes we just saw Saturn and Jupiter. It was absolutely incredible.
Yes. And it is like you sit there and you look at the night sky and the just size of it. And then you start to hear things you'd not been exposed to before. Well, I know that was the case for me at the Capricorn Caves. I think it was winter last year because it's a great time of year to look at the sky in particular. And it just impacted me for so long thinking about star explosions that had happened in space hundreds of thousands of years before we even get to see it as a little twinkling star.
Yeah, absolutely. And the space-time continuum's quite incredible. And
Mm.
to think that man will eventually venture out into space, it's going to be quite mind-blowing. I hope I'm alive to see that.
Fascinating. I love it. So, Andrea, you are a very committed advocate for your community, especially as a local councillor of the Livingston Shire Council. That is not a job that's a 9 to 5. Like I've not done it, and I've always said people who put their hand up to be in those elected positions, it's almost like it's a vocation. It's your life. It just consumes every aspect of who you are and what you do. But of course, Andrea is still Andrea, and you're such an amazing person. And I'm really curious to understand, those key moments and people and experiences across your entire life before we even got to see Andrea, the counsellor, but those moments that have essentially shaped who you are today. What are some of those that come to mind?
Oh, Nyree. Well, I'm 59 years old, so there's been quite a lot of them, but I might start just as a newborn. I was adopted from birth into a very loving family, and my parents adopted me when they were in their mid 40s in
Mm.
1967. And before I shared in their family, and they had lived so much and experienced so much heartache and also the consternation of war. My father was a World War II veteran, and but my mother and father were married in 1946. So I actually missed a generation. So I grew up with a lot of their music, a lot of the modern music. So I kind of had the best of both worlds. But my dad had a trade and he was a fitter and turner. And my mother was a housewife. You know, she always kept a clean and orderly home. And there was nothing that I wanted for and everything I needed. So I was very, very blessed and fortunate to have that. And I have a brother who's 10 years my senior, and he's their natural son. But my mother had a heap of tragedy in her life. And her first pregnancy, a natural birth was difficult for her. And the baby was birthed by emergency cesarean. And apparently it was a little boy. And unfortunately, he was stillborn. And it was one of those instances where the cord was wrapped around the little baby's neck. So she experienced grief with her first birth, and then she was pregnant for the second time and resulted in a beautiful, healthy and little bonny baby boy, and his name was Kim. And they were very, very happy. And when Kim was about 18 months old, the family attended the Eka in Brisbane. And not long after that, Kim contracted meningitis, and apparently he passed away very quickly at 18 months. And whilst they were still mourning the loss, my mother gave birth to my brother, whose name is Wayne. Now, that's not to be confused with my husband, whose name is also Wayne. So forever I'll be Wayne and I'll be known as Wayne and Andrea, or Andrea and Wayne. My goodness, my whole life. And my brother's still alive and still with us today. But when he was 8 years of age, my mother's final pregnancy resulted in twin boys who once again were stillborn. And this enduring sadness that my mother held until her death. Mum died of bowel cancer in 1990 when I was 23 years old. But in 1967, I was born to a very young teenager and was given up for adoption immediately from birth. But I always refer to, and in this context today, I'll always refer to my adoptive parents as my mum and dad, who they actually were. And my mum always said that the doctors had taken pity on her and fast-tracked my adoption, or her adoption request for a little girl. And I was born in the right place at the right time. And Mum always laughed that my birth was the easiest of them all. And she recounted that at the time of receiving a phone call from the hospital, she was hoovering. She called it hoovering the floors, so vacuuming the floors. And at that time in 1967, apparently they tried very hard to match the looks of the baby to the family of the adoption. And I fit right in with the brown eyes, the light olive skin, and even matching noses.
Wow.
So yeah, it was quite incredible. And so Mum always wanted a little girl, and so I came along. So for me, it's not, people sometimes ask, you know, your adoptive parents, are they your mum and dad or your natural parents? Well, my mum and dad were my adoptive parents because I was their daughter, legally and in every sense of the word. So yeah, but my dad, Leonard Percival Barker, because my maiden name was Barker. Well, that's another story because I had two little dogs when I first moved to Yeppoon, and they were registered as Tia Maria and Mitch Barker, which gave a lot of fun and laughter at the vet, but that's another story. So my father served in the Australian Army, and he served from 1939 to 1945, and he saw a lot of action in Darwin, New Guinea, and also in Japan as part of the Imperial Forces. They used to call it the cleanup forces after the atomic bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And my parents married in 1946, and at that time, they actually settled into a domestic life, everyday life. And so by the time I entered their lives, my father was the typical family provider as a fitter and turner with Dunlop IBC, and they were located in Urongapilly in Brisbane. But he never spoke of the war or his time with the Defence Force. But I really don't believe that time he served had ever really left him. He certainly liked to have a drink, but I grew up in Brisbane in Highgate Hill, and I attended Dutton Park State School, which was situated directly right next to Bogger Road Jail. And our primary school was consistently the target of bomb scares or bomb threats. And it was really a regular occurrence for alarms to ring out, and all the students were assembled on the oval. And I remember once early in my primary school years, there was an escapee from the jail with a handgun sitting at the edge of the oval, but apparently he was quickly disarmed and taken back into custody.
Mm.
And but it was quite incredible, really, because yeah, all of those alarms would just go off, multiple times a week because the jail was next
Wow.
door. Yeah,
Mm.
it was incredible. But at school, I actually enjoyed track and field sports in primary school, and I have many second ribbons because there was one girl called Erin, and she was just the fastest sprinter and she always won, and I'll never forget her. But I tell you what, coming second constantly throughout all of my primary school years, this really grounded my determination to always finish what I started and to keep going. And that, second was great, and you don't always win, but you've got to be in the race. Yeah. And in high school, I went to Brisbane State High. Now, I was not an outstanding student, although at the time I revelled in intra-school debating. And I think this is one of the reasons why I thoroughly enjoy my current role as a councillor for the Livingston Shire Council, because as I said, I'm 59 and I still utilise these skills learned when I was 13 years of age. But at the time, I was enrolled to finish my senior, but I left school without completing my senior. My father and mother placed a greater emphasis on earning money for a secure future rather than academia. And this is much to my regret later in life. And I always said that when I leave council, I'm going to go and study at university. So we'll see what happens there. And
Yeah.
that's another chapter for the future. So I left school and I worked in pharmacies and I worked at Proud's Jewellers in Brisbane. And Proud's afforded me the opportunity to relocate as a young adult to Cairns for 7 years. And relocating without knowing a soul opened a door to my love of community, where I
Mm.
joined the youth of Rotary. So get in the act, join Rotaract. Always also, for a short time, I volunteered for visitation at the Cairns Base Hospital, but that was only a very short stint. I think I was 21 years old at the time, and I don't think I was emotionally mature to really continue on with those visitations because I used to meet the lonely, the sick, and those not really valued in society. And I remember
Mm.
there was one young man who I've never forgotten who I visited, and he was such a good looking young man. He was in his 20s and he was friendly and charismatic. And one day I visited the hospital and he was no longer in his room, nor was he alive. He
Oh,
died from
wow.
he died from complications due to the AIDS virus, and this was 1989. And
Mm.
so at the time, as I said, I don't think I was very mature to handle that. And it really was quite emotional for me. So that's where I stopped the visitation at the time.
Mm. Wow. Look, I really like your point about going to a new town and being a part of the community and how to get involved, and especially when you go somewhere and you don't know anyone, and then you just get yourself involved and you get to know people and you get to meet people and interact with people who maybe you otherwise wouldn't voluntarily go out and socialize with or meet in a normal setting, for example. And it provides
Absolutely.
such diversity.
It does. And some people are a little bit nervous about doing it. It may be you've gone to a new town, as you've said, or it could be the fact that you've had life changing experiences and want to try something new. But it really does, joining a club opens the door to
Mm.
having that fellowship and that friendship with new people and learning new things. So yeah, no, I fully endorse that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much about your start in life. It's quite eye-opening because sometimes we sit back, particularly for yourself in the role that you do, and a lot of people just see you as the role that you do. You know, they forget about the fact that you have an entire life outside of a job title, essentially. And there's so many contributing factors to shaping you to be the way that you are. And, evident by your upbringing, your adoption, your family, your parents. Yeah, it must have been very, very challenging for your mum to live with what she was living with. And then, of course, your dad and the war. But I mean, you're such a positive person who always sees the bright side of life. Did that come from your parents as well, even though they had their own challenges?
I think it did. I think it's nature and nurture as
Mm.
well. And I think a person's nature is within them. I can't stop smiling. Smiling is just completely natural to me. And I was told once that when you smile, you actually release, even if you don't feel like smiling, you release those endorphins into your brain that make you feel calmer, make you feel a little cheerier than what you may not feel if you're feeling down. And
Mm.
it's basically one of those things that our body does naturally. So, yeah, I think smiling, even if you don't feel like it certainly does help. But my mother once, when I was born and adopted from birth, I still have it. It's a little plaque on a little tile, and it was a poem, and it said, "Not flesh of my flesh, nor bone of my bone, but miraculously, nevertheless my own. Never
Mm.
forget for even a minute you did not grow under my heart, but in it." So
Oh,
yeah, and
wow.
that's taken me through life as well, knowing, that love is a choice as well as
Mm.
a natural feeling from a mum who's given birth to a child as well. But yeah, so that certainly has shaped certainly my life. But
Mm.
as you know, Nyree, life is full of different journeys
Mm.
and experiences that shape us.
Absolutely. Which sort of leads me into my next question because, going from, say, Prouds and community work and Rotary and volunteering at the hospital and the gap that's happened between, say, the age of 21 and a few years ago now, actually, that you were elected, because I think you're in your second term. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Yes. What was that turning point that led you onto this path of service to the community through an elected position with the Livingston Shire Council?
Well, when I lived in Cairns, as I've said, so I used to drive to Brisbane for family visits, and on the way, I always found myself, and I say this word quite literally, inexplicably drawn to the Yeppoon sign along the highway. But it wasn't until decades later that I followed that sign. And in 2001, just after the September 11th attacks in America, I moved to Blackwater, and I had friends that worked at the mines, and they encouraged me to move there. And at the time, I just finished a relationship with someone, and I was a bit heartbroken, and I decided a change would be a great idea. So I thought, I didn't understand what a mining town was. I thought it was a country town. And growing up in the city of Brisbane, a country change would be relaxing. And I
Mm.
didn't understand the difference between the two. But I did get there, and I found work at the mines testing coal, and I tested it for different aspects of the coals, for calorific value, which is the total amount of heat energy released, which when coal is put under complete combustion, and I tested it for ash content, and to find out the quality of coal being sent overseas and to local power plants. But I really enjoyed this experience, although I thoroughly missed working in a corporate environment. And so in this podcast today with you, I am missing out a large chunks of my life in Brisbane and in Sydney. I lived in Sydney for a number of years after having left Cairns. But in those areas, I was employed with large corporations. But I know we don't have all day, and I digress. So back to Blackwater. So when I moved to Blackwater, I said I'd missed working for the corporate enterprise. So an opportunity arose after working at the mines for a little while. And then there was a job at Ergon Energy in Rockhampton, and they were advertising for employment. So a friend of mine happened to have a house in Yeppoon and needed a person to live there and look after it. And all my ducks lined up for me, and I gained the corporate employment and relocated to Yeppoon. So the day I packed up a trailer and travelled to Yeppoon was the first sight I had of the Capricorn coast. And
Wow.
just travelling the Yeppoon Road to the crest and entry of the old Rockhampton Road, it took my breath away, because all of a sudden the shimmering water of Keppel
Mm.
Bay was a magnificent silhouette, with the magnificent silhouette of a great Keppel Island came into view. And on the day, it was a crisp blue sky, and that made me smile. And that was the 2nd of January 2004. So with a new job in this corporate environment, I made new friends and a beautiful new place to live. And life was just great, and continues to be here on the Capricorn coast for me. So after 5 years of commuting to Rockhampton, I applied for and gained a position with the Rockhampton Regional Council when both councils were amalgamated. And
Mm.
this was in 2009. And I'd already moved at that stage. I left the house I was looking after and moved into a cottage with my two little dogs. And this is where I met my husband. So even though I didn't know it at the time because we were neighbours. We became firm friends,
Wow.
and one thing led to another. Talk about jumping the fence. I was lazy. I always say I was lazy and he was willing. So so I started my journey in education within local government as a customer service officer or support officer for 11 years. And the more information I absorbed about local government, the more I grew to absolutely love the organisation. And as the third tier of government, it directly deals with local issues and it builds
Mm,
communities that are livable. And like for me, local government is so much more than rates, roads, and rubbish. It is
mm,
supporting community initiatives with either financial or in-kind assistance. But that's not to undermine rates, roads and rubbish. Try saying that fast. And I'll add sewage to that notation. That's
yes.
important. These are the areas that council have an obligation for mandatory reliance to keep our shire clean and healthy. But, I also believe that it councils look after the well-being of the community, but we
Mm,
might get to that a little later. But in 2019, I had a lot of discussion with my husband and I decided to throw my hat in the ring and run for council. And this came about when, like many others, I was literally whinging one Sunday afternoon. True, whinging about council and
mhm,
enjoying a glass of wine. And my husband must have been frustrated with my whining about this or that in relation to it. And he said, look, if you want to make a difference, do something about it.
mm,
Whinging and whining does nothing more than a short term feel good emotion. And
mm,
which was true. So I applied for taking my whole long service leave at the time because I'd earned the long service leave and
mm.
embarked on campaigning in the 2020 local government elections. And I was elected. So, yeah, that was not just a surprise, possibly for some, but it was a surprise to me as well. And
Mm.
I've applied myself 100% ever since.
You absolutely have. You absolutely have. I don't
Yeah.
think 100% would even be a good enough percentage. Like, there are a few people that I look around at in local government as well as state and federal, and I just look and I go, they're giving like 500%. And yeah, I do think you're one of those people. I mean, you do, of course, have to balance your own health and well-being, and you can't be everywhere to everyone or everything to everyone or everywhere, but you sure do try.
You. And you said it much earlier yourself, Nyree. It's a vocation. I believe it's a
Mm,
vocation. It's not a 9 to 5 job. It's
mm,
24/7. And it's about time management as well and
mm,
how well you do manage your time. But I will say to anyone who wants to run for any tier of government as a public figure, you know, it's more than just a job. It is a vocation. It's about what do you want to get out of this for your community. It's not so
mm,
much what you want to get out of it for yourself, although that also is included because for myself, I really do just get out of having contributed and making a difference and helping people. And you can't help everyone, but
mm.
you've got to try to at least do your best for the greater good.
Absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes I think about it being similar to, I'm not sure actually if you've ever owned a small business, but one of my friends opened a small business recently and they'd been working at it for months to get it off the ground. And I think it was about maybe 3 or 4 weeks in, literally turned to me and said, "How do you do this? It's 24/7." And of course, it's not the same. I completely appreciate that, but being a small business owner or a medium business owner and, being an elected member, you just live and breathe what you've chosen to do because that's the arena that you've entered essentially.
Absolutely. And my husband works for himself. So he's a
Mm,
small business owner and
yes.
he's an auto electrician. And so I completely understand what you're saying is correct. And
Mm,
but it really is if you only get out of anything in life as much as you put into it. So yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, coming to your poon and having that moment where you've got a job in Rocky, then you've moved to the Rocky Regional Council and which was amalgamated at the time and was, Rocky was taking care of the Capricorn Coast for a short period there. How has that really shaped your story? Like living on the Capricorn Coast and working in Rocky, being a part of that amalgamation and then the de-amalgamation. Obviously, don't want to fixate on the amalgamation or the de-amalgamation, but like, what does the Capricorn Coast, what does that community contribution mean to you personally?
Well, that's a really good question because before I became a councillor in 2020, I involved myself in community groups. I was a member of this for quite a number of years. So it's fair to say that I experienced on-ground emergency responses,
Mm.
and there was a lot of training involved as well on weekends and of an evening. And I was a team member in a land search at Mount Archer, which
Mm.
is Baga National Park. And Baga National Park, formerly Mount Jim Crow, and won't mention the names of the missing. However, I will mention climbing through thick lantana in the midsummer heat wasn't a pleasant way to spend a day, but the
Mm.
call for service was required. And within SES in 2011, there was a fire that spread uncontrollably near Bega, and I stood for hours undertaking traffic control. Although there's a funny story with this. Preparing at short notice. So when you get a call out on SES, you never know when an emergency is going to happen. So you need to
Mm.
be prepared, but preparing at short notice. So I made sure that I had the necessities, the water, the PPE, lollies for energy, and tissues in my pocket. And the only tissues I could grab at the time were some novelty ones I purchased from the news agency, and they had the $50 Australian note printed on them. And they and they were all I had to take with me. So after 6 hours of hydrating, I
Mm.
really had to go, if you know what I mean. And I
Mm.
approached a senior SES member, and I was on the Yeppoon Road, and the road was closed both ways. And that person said, "Just go pee in the bushes." So I had no choice but to urgently go, because I also didn't know how long I was going to be there for. So I headed towards the bushes, and it was now dark. It was dark at this time. And this day I was wearing overalls, so I had to quickly strip off. And they were told, the road's closed, no one's going to come past. But at that moment, a media helicopter flew over, lights
Oh,
blaring.
no.
So I threw myself amongst the bushes and, no longer fearing snakes or other creepy crawlies. Needless to say, that was a close call. And when I was finished, I had no choice but to use those tissues with the $50 notes printed on them, and I had to leave them behind. So I can only hope that no dog walkers found them and thought that they had won the jackpot,
Mm.
because that would have been just,
Not nice.
hilarious,
Mm.
hilarious. If you wish to cut that story out, you're more than welcome to. Um,
No, that's
uh,
fantastic. I love that
so,
story.
so now back to SES services. I assisted in mucking out foul sewage in floods, in the 2011 floods in Rockhampton, and mud piles. And it was really interesting to see dead fish in the rafters of people's homes. And I can't forget I can't forget filling sandbags for rain events. But overall, this is more than gaining experience. This is about service and a willingness to give of your own time for the betterment of the community, which really relates to council being an elected member as well. In 2013, I had my own radio show with the local community radio Keppel FM. And in 2016, I joined the Yeppoon Choral Society and took part in 4 productions, and also the
Wow.
Christmas concert raising funds for other community groups. So as a councillor, I find it difficult to find time for extra assistance, although I have become a member of the Mount Chalmers Historical Society, and I've also joined Rockhampton Zonta, which is so important, raising funds for empowering women and girls worldwide through
Mm.
service and advocacy. And I'm also a member of the Capricorn Coast Hospital Association, also raising much needed funds through a weekly bingo for supplying the hospital with extras like mechanical pet dogs and cats. And these are given to dementia patients. And these little they're more than toys. They have proven success, relieving the patients of anxiety. And the nursing staff has said that they found that less medication is required when the patients have these realistic toys. And it's not only toys, it's equipment that's urgently required. And there are incredible members of that Capricorn Hospital Association that actually undertake beautiful patchwork quilts for end
Mm.
of life patients. And these quilts are not only gorgeous, they are a gift to the grieving families.
Oh,
And they also
wow.
have a practical application too, because when they're lying over the patient who is at end of life, it notifies all levels of staff that the person is at end of life,
Mm.
so that they don't say an awkward thing to the person. Like, are you going to watch the footy this Friday night, Bob?
Mm.
And poor Bob won't be there on Friday night. So
Yes.
yeah, they have that practical application. Now,
Mm.
may I pause for a moment? Because I have to cough.
Yes.
Sorry, still pause. I've had the flu.
Oh,
And
no.
I've had, since this is all paused, I've had the flu since
Yes.
I've seen you last, and I still have the cough. Sorry about that.
It's okay. All good. I
Oh,
feel like I'm
mm.
fighting off something at the moment.
Yeah, it's
Mm.
absolutely shocking. But anyway, I'm no longer contagious, but you still have the cough. So my
Mm.
apologies. So
Okay.
yeah, so I ended that at end of life patient. So that was fine. Back into it. So Nairi, in all of this that we've discussed, it comes back to having a heart for the community. And this, as I said earlier, has been imprinted on my heart for decades, with especially with Rotaract and the hospital visitations in my youth. But here in Livingston Shire, there is over 120 community groups active within our area, and most of all of these are volunteers. And this does not include the 125 council volunteers who gladly give their time and effort to enhance the
Mm.
community. And having been a volunteer, I can confidently say that when you give yourself to the community, the personal benefits you reap, those of feeling valued, making friends to combat loneliness. It's a
Mm.
reason to get out of bed, learning new skills and keeping active. And this is what community contribution means to me. And so, yeah.
That's wonderful. And I think sometimes people are a little bit hesitant to get involved, or they might be unsure or nervous. And I mean, the great thing is you can just go along and try something out, see if it's for you. And if it doesn't quite work out, try something else. Like there will absolutely be something that you can connect with. And being part of something that's bigger than yourself is so rewarding. And so
Always.
many people would know that, but also so many people might not because they may not have grown up in an environment where they, had these influences or this desire to serve.
No, that's absolutely correct. You're spot on.
Yeah. So, in everything that you've done and been through in your time to date, like still very young, you've still got, in my books, 41
Thank
years
you.
ahead of you.
Yeah,
Uh,
thank you.
so sometimes in life things happen and they really kind of change the direction that we're taking, or they change our perspective. It can be, a significant challenge that we've overcome, or a really proud moment that's kind of recalibrated our course. Have you got something like that that comes to mind for yourself that really either changed your perspective or changed your course?
Sure, absolutely. Earlier, I spoke about my mum who lost
Mm.
babies and why I was adopted from birth. And there was much grief throughout her life through these sad circumstances, and often intergenerational grief or lessons not learnt in one generation may be passed on to the next generation. I mean, this could be in a positive sense or in a negative way. Like a person may grow up to become a doctor like her father and grandfather or grandmother or mother, and this is positive. But also this intergenerational grief and perspective can be passed on in a negative sense. And a person that may have been abused as a child, often occurred because their parents were abused also. And this is where the generational grief may also occur. But my mother had her deep seated grief. And when I found out in my 20s that I was barren and could not have children, I may have taken that same stance and grief for the children that I couldn't have. And
Mm.
this has influenced my perspective on life, that the negatives do not have to be passed along. This is a
Mm.
choice of understanding. My mum had every right to her grief and pain. She held it close, but she did not allow it to affect me. She was not passing it along. And I learned also not to accept another's wrongdoings or their feelings if it was not within my sphere of control, because I believe we can only control what we think, feel, do, or say. And we may influence another person, but we must take responsibility for our own actions and be accountable. My biggest challenge, I would have to say, was becoming a public figure. It was my choice, it was my
Mm.
doing, and I am responsible. It was tough though, losing your anonymity. And in saying this, a person in a public eye grows into the public persona. Not only am I a councillor for Livingston Shire, I am also a community member who grocery shops, turns up
Mm.
to events, and is not only seen but by the public, but we're watched as well. All
Mm.
I can do is live my life, and I believe with humility, because on a personal level, I think humility is the key to good governance. You are a person in the public that and the people have placed their trust in you to take on the responsibility, and it's one that must be taken in the role with honesty and determination to get the job done right for the overall good of the majority and to act with diplomacy. So in saying that, there was a number of things in that particular question, but I suppose also I want to touch on my proudest moment was marrying my husband, because I
Mm.
know that he's got my back with love and integrity, and he's my best friend. And, when he married me, he turned me into a friend.
Yeah.
I'm always
Yes.
a friend, and I love that play on words. So yes, and I actually didn't marry him for the name, but the name helps.
It is a very good it is a very good name. Yes. Oh, that is gold. Thank you. So you've touched on it just a little bit, even just now, that you've lost your anonymity, which I'm just messing that word up, but that's okay.
Okay.
But doing the role that you do in particular, it can be quite challenging, and sometimes I would imagine it's very hard to get up and keep going and pushing forward, serving your community, serving the clubs and organisations that you volunteer with, and doing all of that with a smile. You consistently show up because you've got that level of awareness and maturity, of course, to know that whatever you're going through, you don't need to push that on to the next person who might be engaging with you for a different reason. It's a long way for me to say. When you're having those moments that are really just getting you down, what is the thing that keeps you moving forward, keeps you showing up at Livingston Shire Council, showing up in the community, showing up at your volunteer roles that you still continue to do while doing your councillor role? What's that mindset?
I suppose the mindset is that all local government councillors, and indeed all three tiers of government, take an oath or an affirmation. They're not just words. I've affirmed to make sure that my time in council as to when I leave or I'm not re-elected has made a difference. We have
Mm.
to strive to make our community and the council better than when we found it, and that drives me every day. Of course, I'm human. Every day is different. And some days, and it hasn't happened a lot, to be honest, but there have been very minimal times where I've said, oh, no, I'm not doing this anymore. And then I wake up the next day and I think, gosh, that was a win today. That's worked out for the community. That's worked out for that person.
Mm.
It really drives me. So I suppose at my age, and I've still got a tremendous amount to learn, because we never stop learning until the day we die. We're
Yes.
always learning if we're willing to and open to learn things in life. But when we're young and in our teens, I remember being so busy. You undertake an education, you're discovering yourself, you're trying to navigate and understand relationships, either friendships or romantic relationships. And I know as humans, we seek inclusion in groups, whether it be through family, friends, and community. And this is a great thing. And obviously, it gives us all meaningful life interactions. But my advice is to choose your friend group carefully for those younger people listening, based
Mm.
on common likes and the character of those friends, because I've learnt in my life that bad company certainly corrupts good morals. Let your yes be yes and your no mean no. If you have to think about a decision, sleep on it, not jump into making a decision on the spot could be through emotion, anger, joy, or feeling like you might miss out, or feeling pressured to make a decision. Think about it, because good friends and good relationship partners will have patience for you to make your decisions in your time and not force you into anything you may or may not want to do. But also, many people will come and go from your life, and it's not always your fault. They just
Mm.
have a different life's journey to yours. And remember always that we can control what we do, say, think, and feel. No, everything else really is beyond our control. We can react and then we can decide how our reaction's going to be. But that's within our sphere of control. We must be accountable and responsible for our actions and words. And mostly, even though it may be uncomfortable at times, be truthful with ourselves, so that the incredible amounts of mistakes that we or you, whoever's listening, will make in your life or I've made in my life become a
Mm.
learning experience, because we are not a failure through these learning experience. Although we may have just failed at something, I want to let everyone know my favorite saying is, this too shall pass and
Yes.
tomorrow is a new day. But most importantly, I'd like to let those listening No, to really consider yourself, be kind to yourself. Most people find out these lessons later in life through experience. But if you're aware of these things at a younger age, your life's
Mm.
journey may be far more rewarding experience for you and maybe a little bit easier to handle either rejection or a failed experience, turning it into a learned experience.
That's so much fantastic advice and experience. And I'm absolutely on board with you just to be a little bit kinder, not only to each other, but to ourselves. We are our harshest critics. Maybe in the public service, there are other people who are your harshest critic, but we don't need to listen to them all of the time. We do enough of a good job ourselves, questioning, have we made the right decision? Did we do the right thing? What did we learn from that mistake? And I love your advice about, failing. This too shall pass. And it's a moment in time. One moment or one failure is not going to define the rest of your journey if you don't let it.
That's exactly right. And I
Mm,
truly believe, Nyree, that things can be difficult in your mind to comprehend moving forward into a new space, like running for council. Well, once you actually step out of your comfort zone and
mm.
give something a go, it just becomes easier to do. So, yeah,
Absolutely. And a couple of weeks ago, I had a podcast guest, just an incredible man. And he's, sometimes you hear a phrase or a piece of advice and it just stays with you forever. And he shared something with me. It was Michael McCabe a couple of weeks before your episode. And he said, it's not hard. It's just not easy yet.
that's
And
right.
it's the kind of phrase where I'm like, that just explains so much. And I can use that to give to other young people, for example. It's not hard. Don't look at something and think that it's hard. It's just not easy yet because you do need to push yourself out of your comfort zone.
That's right. And look, human nature, we actually evolve into what we want to become. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree with Michael and what he said, and
Mm.
it's actually resonated with me as well.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it has been absolutely fantastic having you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for carving out the time in your very busy schedule to meet with me and share a little bit about your story and your journey and more too, who Andrea is outside of Councillor for Livingston Shire Council.
Thank you, Nyree. And I'd like to say that really, for me, this is just a mutual admiration society meeting because I think the world of what you do as well. And so I wish you all the very best moving forward with your podcasts and your newsletters and everything else that you do because you're absolutely amazing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the pleasure and privilege is all mine. I'm the lucky one who gets to talk to people like yourself and selfishly learn through others' experiences.
Thank you, Nyree. It's been a great pleasure for me also.
Thank you.
That's another episode of Rockhampton with Nyree Johnson. If this story stayed with you, follow the show on Spotify and YouTube so the next one finds you. And if you know someone in our region quietly doing good, someone who belongs in this chair, get in touch through www.nyreejohnson.com.au. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.